I remember the exact second the room went quiet, not because of me, but because of what my sister thought was funny. There were 15 VIP guests seated around the private stage at the Global Tech Summit 2026, CEOs, investors, people whose signatures could move millions of dollars in minutes, and Jessica stood under the spotlight like she owned the entire industry. She lifted her glass, smiled like she had already won the room, then pointed straight toward the back where I was standing behind a control console and said, "Some of us close billion-dollar deals, and some of us just collect trash behind the scenes." A few people laughed, quick, polite, automatic, but it died almost instantly, because she didn't stop. She leaned in, enjoying the attention, and added one word that didn't belong in that room: Project Titan. That was when the silence changed. Not awkward, not social, something colder. Because what she said next didn't just humiliate me. It triggered something that would destroy her entire career in less than 24 hours. At first, I didn't react the way she expected. No embarrassment, no defensive smile, no attempt to reclaim dignity in front of people who had already placed me somewhere beneath their attention. Instead, I watched. Because in rooms like that, reactions don't come from emotion, they come from awareness. Across the table, one of the senior legal advisors stopped mid-motion, his hand hovering above a document like something had just interrupted a calculation. A woman near the center lowered her phone slowly, her expression tightening in a way that had nothing to do with discomfort. Near the exit, someone stood up without a word, not leaving yet, just repositioning. That was the first signal, the kind you only notice if you understand how quickly power can shift when information crosses the wrong boundary. My name is Eliana Monroe. I'm 29. And to everyone in that room, I was exactly what Jessica said I was. Background staff, operations support, the person who makes things run smoothly without ever becoming part of what people remember. I stood behind a sleek black console, tablet in my hand, monitoring what looked like schedules, access flows, minor adjustments to keep the event seamless. From the outside, I was invisible, replaceable, easy to reduce to a joke that made someone else look bigger. And that's exactly how my family had always positioned me. Jessica was the one they introduced. I was the one they explained. But what no one in that room, including Jessica, understood was that the tablet in my hand wasn't just tracking logistics. It was connected to a live compliance system running silent protocols across every conversation, every restricted keyword, every layer of access tied to the non-disclosure agreements every single person in that room had signed before they were even allowed inside. The system didn't watch people. It watched risk. And when Jessica said Project Titan out loud, in a space where that name was never supposed to exist beyond secured channels, the system didn't hesitate. It didn't question intent. It didn't recognize family. It only recognized breach. The air shifted before anyone said a word. You could feel it in the way conversations didn't resume, in the way people stopped leaning back and started leaning inward, not toward Jessica, but toward their own devices, their own thoughts, their own legal awareness. A CEO subtly turned his chair, distancing himself without making it obvious. Another reached for his phone but didn't unlock it yet, as if waiting for confirmation he already suspected was coming. Jessica misread all of it. She thought she had created impact, that the silence meant she had their full attention. She didn't see the recalculation happening around her. At the far end of the room, a lawyer closed his folder slowly and stood up, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to mark that something had crossed from acceptable into recorded. That movement alone told me everything. Because in environments like this, no one reacts unless there is already a reason that will need to be documented later. I didn't look at Jessica. I didn't acknowledge the shift in the room. I lowered my gaze to the screen, placed my finger on a single command, and tapped once. The interface responded immediately, locking onto the moment she spoke, isolating the audio, marking the timestamp with precision that didn't allow for interpretation. Then I spoke into the comm channel, my voice steady, almost detached from everything happening under the lights. Log that timestamp. And while she was still standing there, still smiling, still believing she was in control of the narrative. My sister had already stepped into a system she had no power to stop. People think humiliation begins in moments like that, under bright lights, in front of people who matter. But for me, it started in quieter rooms where nothing was loud enough to be called cruelty, and yet everything was sharp enough to stay with you. Long before that night at the summit, I had already learned what it meant to be reduced in ways that didn't leave visible marks. Dinner tables where Jessica's achievements were presented like headlines and mine were summarized in a single dismissive word. Logistics. That was always the word they used for me. It sounded harmless, practical, almost useful, but in our family it meant something else entirely. It meant background. It meant you don't ask questions. It meant you exist to make other people's success look effortless. Jessica was always introduced first. My mother, Linda, would smile in that polished way she reserved for other people and say, "Jessica's building something incredible. She's going to change the industry." There was pride in her voice, a kind of certainty that made people lean in and listen. Then, almost as an afterthought, she would gesture toward me and add, "Eliana helps with operations." Not even a full sentence, just enough to acknowledge I was there without ever giving me a place in the conversation. And people followed her lead. They would nod, smile politely, and then turn back to Jessica like I had already said everything I was capable of saying. I wasn't part of the decisions that shaped our family's direction, not the financial ones, not the long-term plans. Conversations would shift when I entered a room. Voices would lower, doors would close just before I reached them, and when I asked questions, real ones, I always got the same response. "It's complicated." Or worse, "You wouldn't understand." It wasn't just dismissal. It was a pattern, a quiet, consistent reinforcement of where I belonged and where I didn't. About 3 years before the summit, I remember standing in Jessica's apartment, helping her prepare for one of her early startup events. Papers were spread across the table, schedules, contracts, guest lists, everything moving fast in that chaotic way she thrived in. She handed me a document without looking up. "Just sign this," she said. "Internal NDA. Everyone signs it." I took the paper, expecting something routine, but as I scanned it, something didn't sit right. It wasn't obvious at first, just a weight in the wording. And then I saw it. A clause buried near the bottom. Penalty for breach. Not thousands, not even tens of thousands, millions. I asked about it quietly, not accusing, just trying to understand. Jessica didn't even pause. "It's standard," she said, like the conversation was already over. My mother stepped in from across the room, her tone calm but firm in the way she always used when she wanted to shut something down without raising her voice. "Eliana, you always do this. You overthink things that don't matter." That was the moment. Not because of what they said, but because of what they expected. They didn't expect me to read. They expected me to sign. I signed it. But not because I agreed. Because I understood something I hadn't fully seen before. This wasn't just about family roles, it was about perception. They had built a version of me that was convenient, useful, non-threatening, and the more they repeated it, the more everyone else believed it too. To them, I wasn't someone who understood risk or consequence. I was just the one who made things easier for people who did. What they didn't know was that by that point, I had already stepped into a completely different space. Not publicly, not in a way they would ever acknowledge. I had started working with a compliance consulting firm that specialized in high-risk environments. Events where information wasn't just sensitive, it was protected by layers of legal structure most people never see. My role wasn't visible. It wasn't meant to be. I worked behind systems that monitored, enforced, and documented the exact kind of agreements they treated like background paperwork. I had already sat in rooms where one sentence could cost a company millions. I had watched executives lose control of negotiations because of a single misplaced word. I had seen how fast power shifts when information escapes the boundaries it was meant to stay within. And in every one of those situations, the outcome didn't depend on who spoke the loudest or who held the most attention. It depended on what could be proven. But at home, none of that existed. None of it mattered. Because once a role is assigned in a family, it becomes its own kind of system, harder to challenge than any contract. I was still the one they overlooked, still the one they minimized, still the one they never thought to question because they had already decided I didn't have anything worth seeing. And after a while, I stopped correcting them. Not because they were right, but because letting them believe that version of me gave me something they didn't understand the value of: silence, space, time to build something they would never recognize until they were already standing inside it. They thought I worked behind the scenes, and they were right, just not in the way they imagined. By the time my family had fully settled into the version of me they were comfortable with, quiet, helpful, invisible, I had already stepped into a world where silence meant something entirely different. In that world, the people who spoke the least were often the ones with the most control, not because they demanded it, but because they understood how systems worked beneath everything others could see. I didn't build my career in a way that impressed people at dinner tables. There were no titles that sounded important, no moments designed to be admired. What I built was something else entirely. I learned how high-stakes environments function when everything depends on information staying exactly where it belongs. The firm I worked with didn't advertise what we did. We were brought in when the risk was already high, when the room was filled with people who had too much to lose for anything to go wrong. Investor briefings, pre-announcement negotiations, closed-door summits where a single detail leaking at the wrong moment could shift markets before anyone had time to react. My role wasn't to be seen. It was to design and maintain the structures that prevented those mistakes from happening in the first place. Systems that monitored, recorded, and enforced the boundaries everyone agreed to before they walked into the room. About 18 months before the summit, one of our clients came dangerously close to losing everything over something that, on the surface, looked insignificant. A junior executive mentioned the name of a project in a semi-secured lounge area. Just a name, 2 words spoken in the wrong place at the wrong time. But those 2 words moved faster than anyone expected. Within hours, fragments of that information began circulating outside the controlled environment. By the next morning, competitors were already reacting, legal teams were mobilizing, and the client was staring at a potential loss that crossed into 8 figures. That was the first time my system was pushed beyond theory. I wasn't the one speaking in the emergency meeting that followed. I wasn't the one making decisions out loud. I sat in the corner with a live interface open, tracking everything that had happened in that space, every access point, every interaction, every second that led to the moment the boundary was crossed. I isolated the exact timestamp of the leak, identified the source, and built a complete evidence chain that allowed the legal team to respond before the situation escalated further. It didn't erase the damage, but it contained it. And in that world, containment is often the difference between survival and collapse. After it was over, one of the senior investors approached me. Not in a way that drew attention, not in a way anyone else would notice. He paused next to my station, glanced at the interface still open on my screen, and said quietly, "Whoever designed this system controls the entire room without being seen." Then he walked away. No recognition, no formal acknowledgement. But in that moment, I understood something my family never could. Power doesn't always need to be visible to be absolute. What I had built wasn't just a tool. It was a real-time compliance system designed to operate without hesitation. It tracked restricted keywords, monitored access levels, and automatically logged any potential breach the moment it occurred. It didn't wait for someone to interpret what had happened. It recorded it, locked it, preserved it in a way that couldn't be altered without triggering additional alerts. Once something was captured inside that system, it didn't disappear. It became part of a record that existed beyond opinion or explanation. The most effective part of it was that no one really noticed it working. Executives would sit in those rooms believing they controlled every aspect of the conversation. Investors would negotiate, founders would present, deals would take shape in real time. But beneath all of it, there was a structure quietly observing everything, documenting every movement, every word that mattered. They thought they owned the room. In reality, they were operating inside something I had designed. And that's where the irony begins. Because while I was building systems that defined how those rooms functioned, my sister was building a reputation that depended entirely on being seen inside them. Jessica thrived on visibility, on attention, on being the person people remembered after everything was over. And when I received the final attendee list for the Global Tech Summit 2026, her name was there, highlighted under VIP speakers, positioned exactly where she wanted to be. I remember looking at her name for a few seconds longer than necessary, not because of emotion, because of understanding. Rooms like that don't respond to confidence. They respond to boundaries, and those boundaries don't adjust for personality, status, or intention. They exist, and once they are crossed, the outcome doesn't depend on who you are. It depends on what can be proven. The system I built had already protected millions of dollars without anyone ever knowing my name. And on the night of the summit, without realizing it, my sister walked straight into it. By the time the summit officially began, everything that mattered was already in place. Events like this don't start when the first speaker steps on stage. They start hours earlier in secured briefings, access checks, and quiet confirmations that every layer of control is functioning exactly as designed. I was at my station before the first guest arrived, standing behind the console with my tablet synced into the system, watching the interface run its final diagnostics. From the outside, it looked like I was managing schedules and minor adjustments. Inside the system, every parameter was already active, every safeguard aligned, every variable accounted for. Jessica arrived exactly the way she always did, just late enough to be noticed and confident enough to make it look intentional. She moved through the room like it already belonged to her, greeting investors, exchanging quick remarks, positioning herself where the attention naturally gathered. I watched her badge scan through the access point, her credentials activating without delay. She didn't hesitate, didn't review the briefing materials sent earlier, didn't acknowledge the structure she had just entered. To her, this was another stage, another opportunity to perform, not an environment governed by rules she couldn't see. The first irregularity appeared on my screen within minutes. It was small, a deviation in scheduling access. Jessica had requested a change to the speaking order, not through the designated coordinator, but directly through a junior staff member who didn't have the authority to approve it. It wasn't a violation yet, just a signal, the kind of signal that usually precedes something more significant. I flagged it internally, not as a breach, but as a pattern forming. Through the comm channel, I could hear her voice as she pressed further. Calm, polished. But underneath it, there was that familiar certainty I had known my entire life, the assumption that things would adjust around her if she pushed just enough. "It'll improve the flow," she said, smiling in a way that made it sound like a decision rather than a request. And slowly, the structure of the event began to shift. Minor adjustments, small accommodations, nothing that would raise concern on the surface, but enough to open gaps, enough to weaken the boundaries that were supposed to remain fixed. About 20 minutes later, a message came through from one of the assistants stationed near the restricted discussion zone. Their voice was controlled, but there was tension in it. Jessica had started asking questions, not general ones, specific ones, about a segment labeled under internal code, Project Titan. The assistant explained that the area required clearance, that certain topics were restricted, that access wasn't determined by speaker status. Jessica laughed it off. I could hear it clearly through the channel. "If I'm speaking here, I should know what I'm walking into." On my screen, her movement toward that restricted zone triggered a secondary layer of monitoring. Not a breach, but close enough to adjust the system's sensitivity. Keyword tracking tightened, logging intervals shortened. Every interaction around her began recording at a higher level of precision. The system wasn't reacting emotionally, it was preparing. I watched her move through the room the way she always had, assuming presence was enough to justify access, assuming confidence could replace permission. And for a moment, something familiar surfaced. Not anger, not resentment, just recognition. This wasn't new behavior. It was the same pattern, just placed in a different environment. The difference was, this environment didn't adjust to protect it. Then came the decision that removed the last layer of protection she had without even realizing it. Jessica requested a last-minute change to her speech. No compliance review, no content check. She told the coordinator she wanted to make it more impactful. The coordinator hesitated, but under pressure and time constraints, the request was approved with a reduced review process. That decision didn't trigger the system, but it eliminated the final safeguard that would have stopped her before she crossed a line. From my position, I could see the indicators aligning in real time. Increased keyword proximity, unauthorized curiosity about restricted information, deviation from approved material, each one manageable on its own. Together, they formed a pattern I had seen before, a pattern that never depended on intention, only outcome. As Jessica adjusted her posture and stepped toward the stage, preparing to deliver what she believed would elevate her position in that room, my screen updated one final time. All monitoring thresholds were fully active, all logging systems were live, and without realizing it, she had just removed every barrier that could have protected her from what was about to happen. By the time Jessica stepped onto the stage, the room had already settled into a controlled silence that most people mistake for attention, but was actually something sharper, something closer to evaluation. The lights adjusted automatically, isolating her under a clean white spotlight while the rest of the room dimmed just enough to focus every eye forward. She looked exactly like she always did in moments like this, composed, confident, fully convinced she understood the space she was standing in. From where I stood behind the console, I could see both versions of reality unfolding at once, the one she believed she controlled and the one already forming beneath it. She started smoothly, her voice steady, her pacing precise, moving through her prepared points with the kind of confidence that usually wins rooms like this. She referenced previous deals, hinted at expansion, framed her trajectory in a way that made her sound both ambitious and inevitable. People nodded, some leaned forward, others took notes. On the surface, everything was working exactly the way she wanted it to. And then, almost without pause, she began to shift. It wasn't obvious at first. A slight change in tone, a move away from information and toward comparison, toward positioning herself above others in the room. I saw the first indicator before she even said the words. A deviation in phrasing. A pattern I had seen before in environments where people move off script without realizing the risk they're approaching. They don't jump into danger immediately. They circle it, test it, push just enough to feel control. The system registered the shift instantly. Monitoring tightened. Keyword sensitivity increased. Invisible adjustments, but precise. Then she turned toward the back of the room. Toward me. It wasn't necessary. It didn't add anything to her presentation, but it gave her something she had always relied on: superiority. She smiled, tilted her head slightly, and said, "Some of us are here building billion-dollar opportunities." She paused, letting the room lean into the moment she was creating. "And some of us are just handling the trash behind the scenes." A few people reacted automatically, a reflex shaped by social cues more than agreement. But it didn't hold. The laughter faded almost immediately, replaced by something quieter, more uncertain. Jessica misread it completely. She thought the silence meant impact, that she had drawn the room deeper into her control. But what she didn't see was the recalculation already happening. The shift from listening to assessing, the kind of shift that doesn't come from emotion but from risk awareness. And then she said it. Without hesitation. Without awareness. "I'm the one bringing in deals like Project Titan." 2 words, that was all it took. No context, no explanation, just a name that was never supposed to leave a secured channel. The moment those words left her mouth, the system didn't pause. It didn't consider intent. It executed. The room didn't react loudly. It froze. Conversations stopped mid-thought. A CEO near the center turned his head slowly, not toward Jessica, but toward his legal advisor. A woman seated 2 places down lowered her pen without writing anything, her posture tightening as she processed what had just happened. The energy didn't rise. It dropped. Cold. Controlled. Immediate. I watched it move across the room in seconds, phones unlocking under tables, eyes shifting away from the stage, one investor quietly closing his folder as if the meeting had already ended. These weren't emotional reactions. They were protective ones. Distancing, containment, preparation for consequence. Behind the console, my screen shifted from passive observation to active response. The flagged keyword triggered a full capture protocol, timestamp locked, audio segment isolated, access logs cross-referenced automatically. Every layer of the system aligned around a single point of data, the exact moment the boundary had been crossed. I didn't look up. I didn't react to the room. I placed my finger on the command interface and pressed once, confirming what the system had already identified. Then I spoke into the comm channel, my voice steady, controlled, detached from the tension building under the lights. Log that timestamp. Jessica was still smiling when I said it, still standing under the spotlight, still believing she had control over the narrative unfolding in front of her. She hadn't realized that the sentence she used to elevate herself had already been captured, secured, and transformed into something she could no longer manage or undo. In that moment, while she was still performing, the outcome had already been decided. The sound came first, not loud enough to interrupt the room, but precise enough that the people who understood systems like this recognized it instantly. A single notification tone, sharp and controlled, followed by another, then several more in quick succession. It didn't echo through speakers. It moved through devices, phones lighting up, tablets vibrating subtly against polished surfaces. On my screen, the interface shifted without hesitation, the neutral display replaced by a red alert line that left no room for interpretation. Critical breach detected. Jessica continued speaking for a second longer, her voice still carrying the confidence she had walked on stage with, but something in her timing faltered. Not because she understood what had happened, but because she felt the room change around her. People weren't watching her anymore. They were looking down, reading, processing, recalculating, faces tightened in controlled ways, posture shifting not out of discomfort, but out of recognition. The spotlight still held her in place, but the attention had already moved elsewhere. 15 separate notifications moved through the room at nearly the same moment, each one carrying identical information. Timestamp, audio capture, identified keyword, legal reference, potential penalty. The system didn't warn, it documented, and once documentation exists in a room like that, everything that follows becomes inevitable. The side door opened without urgency, but with purpose. 2 members of the compliance team stepped inside, followed by a senior legal advisor whose presence alone shifted the weight of the room. They didn't look at Jessica first. They exchanged a brief glance with each other, confirming alignment before anything else. Then one of them gave a small, almost imperceptible nod toward an investor seated near the center. That was enough. Chairs began to move. Conversations stopped completely. One by one, the investors disengaged. Quietly, efficiently. A folder closed here, a chair pulled back there, documents gathered without noise, devices locked with deliberate movements. No one raised their voice. No one created a scene. This wasn't panic. It was protocol. Distance yourself. Reduce exposure. Protect position before the situation expands beyond control. As one of them passed behind my station, I caught a single sentence, spoken low enough that it wasn't meant to carry. She just triggered a multi-million penalty. There was no disbelief in it, no emotion, just a recognition of consequence already in motion. I stepped away from the console without rushing, the tablet in my hand now displaying a fully compiled incident log. Not partial data, not fragments, a complete chain. Timestamp locked to the second. Audio segment isolated. Cross-referenced access points confirming presence and authorization boundaries. I moved to stand beside the compliance lead, not behind them, not as support, but aligned with the process that was now unfolding. Jessica stopped speaking. Not immediately, but slowly, like the momentum she had built no longer had anything to hold on to. The smile on her face didn't disappear all at once. It faltered, hesitated, then shifted into something uncertain. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice still trying to hold its structure. No one answered her directly, not because they didn't hear her, because the question itself no longer mattered. "It was just an example," she added quickly, the words coming faster now, trying to reshape what had already been said. "A figure of speech. But the system doesn't interpret intent. It records events, and the event had already been captured, secured, and distributed. A printed document slid from the nearby terminal, the physical form of what already existed digitally across multiple secured channels. The compliance officer took it, scanned it once, then began reading aloud. Not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly enough that the room could hear. Timestamp, identified speaker, recorded phrase, restricted keyword, NDA clause violation, estimated financial exposure. Each line landed without emotion, but with finality. Jessica wasn't being evaluated anymore. She was being defined. Not as a speaker, not as a founder, as a liability. And in a room built on trust and controlled information, liability is the one thing no one stays close to. I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to. The system had already done everything it was designed to do. It didn't argue. It didn't react. It documented. And from that moment forward, everything that followed would be built on that record, not on what she intended, but on what she had already made permanent. The fallout didn't explode. It unfolded, measured, and controlled, like a process that had already been defined long before anyone realized they were inside it. Within the first 24 hours after the summit, internal reports were finalized, legal teams initiated formal reviews, and investor groups began quietly repositioning themselves away from anything connected to the incident. Nothing public, nothing dramatic, just movement, strategic, deliberate, irreversible. By the second day, the consequences started becoming visible in ways Jessica couldn't control. Meetings that had been confirmed disappeared from calendars without explanation. Calls went unanswered. A funding round that had been in its final stage of negotiation was suddenly under reassessment. No one said why. They didn't need to. In environments built on confidentiality, silence is the language of withdrawal. Her company didn't collapse overnight. It unraveled, slowly, precisely, one partnership at a time, one agreement at a time. A press appearance she had been preparing for weeks was quietly removed from the schedule. Invitations stopped coming, not because people wanted to punish her, but because no one wanted to be associated with risk that had already been documented at that level. In that world, trust isn't repaired. It's replaced. About 10 days later, a small article appeared online, buried beneath larger financial updates, easy to miss unless you knew exactly what to look for. Anonymous compliance breach at Global Tech Summit results in major contractual penalties for startup founder. No names, no direct references, but anyone who had been in that room understood immediately. And that was enough, because reputation in those circles doesn't depend on public confirmation. It moves through recognition. The first call from my mother came before Jessica ever reached out. Her voice carried urgency, but it was controlled, shaped in the way she had always used when she expected things to resolve in her favor. "Eliana, we need to talk about what happened." Not a question, a direction. "Your sister made a mistake. You're the one managing that system, right? Just fix it. Remove whatever was logged." She said it like it was simple, like it was something I could clean up the way I always had before. I didn't interrupt her. I let her finish, the same way I had done my entire life. Then I answered, not with explanation, not with emotion, just with fact. The system doesn't store data locally. It's encrypted and recorded through a third-party blockchain verification network. Once it's logged, it can't be altered. Not by me, not by anyone. There was a pause on the line, longer than usual. Not confusion, realization, because for the first time she understood something she couldn't influence. "This affects the whole family," she said, her tone tightening slightly, shifting from instruction to pressure. "She's our future." The same word, the same structure, the same assumption that had shaped everything for years. But this time it didn't land the same way, because for the first time it had no leverage. The call ended without resolution, not because we reached one, but because there was nothing left to negotiate. And in that silence, something shifted permanently, not in the system, in us. Jessica's first call came later that day. I didn't answer, then another, then 3 more within the hour. By the end of the night, there were 17 missed calls. The next day, it doubled. Messages started appearing, short at first, then longer, then fragmented. By the end of the second week, the number had reached 98. Calls, voicemails, texts, each one carrying something she had never shown before. Not confidence, not control, urgency, fear, the absence of certainty. She found me outside my office building, not by accident, by persistence, standing near the entrance, waiting in a way that didn't match the version of her I had known for most of my life. No audience, no spotlight, no performance, just someone trying to hold on to something that was already gone. "Eliana, please," she said the moment she saw me, her voice unsteady in a way I had never heard before. "You have to help me. This is destroying everything." For a moment, I just looked at her. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, just clarity. Because the difference between us in that moment wasn't position. It was understanding. She was still trying to fix the outcome. I had already accepted the process. "You didn't embarrass me," I said, my voice calm, unchanged. "You signed your own sentence." The words didn't need force. They carried their own weight. I stepped past her without waiting for a response, entered the building and pressed the elevator button. The doors opened, then closed between us without resistance. No final argument, no dramatic ending, just distance. And for the first time, it didn't feel like I was leaving something behind. It felt like I was stepping into something that had always been waiting for me once I stopped trying to be seen by people who had already decided not to see me at all. What happened after that didn't feel like a victory. Not in the way people imagine when they think about revenge or justice finally catching up with someone who deserves it. There was no moment where everything paused and acknowledged what had changed. It was quieter than that, more controlled. The kind of shift that doesn't need attention to become permanent. In the weeks following the summit, my name started appearing in places it never had before, not in headlines, not in public announcements, but in conversations that actually mattered, in rooms where decisions were made long before anyone outside ever heard about them. I was invited into closed briefings, brought into early-stage discussions where risk was evaluated before strategy was even considered. People didn't ask what I did anymore. They already knew. I wasn't introduced as support or operations or someone who handled logistics. I was introduced as the person who built the system that protected one of the most controlled environments in the industry. And for the first time, I didn't have to explain myself in a way that made me smaller for someone else's comfort. My work spoke clearly, in a language that didn't require validation. One of the same investors who had once passed by me without a second glance now turned to me directly during a meeting and asked for my input before anything was finalized. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't announced. It was simple, direct, and completely natural. But that moment carried more weight than anything my family had ever recognized because it marked a shift that couldn't be undone. I wasn't standing behind the system anymore. I was part of the structure that defined how those environments functioned. Jessica didn't recover from what happened at the summit. Not publicly, not privately. Her name stopped appearing in the spaces she had built her identity around. Her company dissolved quietly under pressure that didn't need to be explained because everyone already understood the cause. There were no public statements, no attempts to rebuild her image, no second chance offered by the same people who had once supported her. In industries built on trust and confidentiality, once that trust is broken, it doesn't come back. It gets replaced. For a long time, I thought that moment would feel like something more intense, like closure would arrive all at once and replace everything that came before it. but it didn't. It felt like distance, like stepping into a space where the noise that had followed me for years simply stopped reaching me. I didn't feel the need to confront my family again. I didn't feel the need to explain what had happened or make them understand my side. I just stopped needing their version of me to define anything. Because what I realized was simple. This was never about proving them wrong. It was about building something that didn't require their recognition in the first place. The system I created didn't exist to punish anyone. It existed to enforce boundaries. And when those boundaries were crossed, the outcome wasn't personal. It was inevitable. I moved forward into a world they never saw. Not because it was hidden, but because they never looked beyond the version of me they had already decided was true. And the irony is, they were always inside what I built. They stood in it, spoke within it, relied on it, without ever realizing who created it or what it could do until it was too late to step outside of it. They never saw me. But they were always inside my system. And if you've ever been placed in a role where your value was only recognized when it served someone else, if you've ever been made to feel invisible in spaces where you knew you had more to offer, I want you to think about this. Would you keep trying to prove yourself to people who already decided who you are, or would you step back, build something of your own, and let the truth reveal itself when it can no longer be ignored? If this story stayed with you, I'd really like to hear your thoughts, because every comment helps shape the next story we tell here. And if you believe in quiet strength, in setting boundaries, and in the kind of success that doesn't need permission to exist, stay with me, subscribe, and be part of a space where stories like this remind you that you were never invisible. You were just seen by the wrong people. This story is fictional. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental.